All right, everyone. So now we're going to get into our next part of our lecture here, which is actually the war itself. And we had talked about, before the war, this euphoria that was developing. People believed that, this war was going to be easy and all these false ideas that they believed. And as we're going to see, it's going to be into this horrible nightmare. And so what I really want to focus on this lecture is kind of the Western Front and these kind of what will be called the trenches of death, that are going to be such a nightmare for so many people. And obviously, you want to take good notes on this. All of this is information you're going to need for your quizzes or for your exams. If you're writing an essay on World War One and the impacts of World War One, one of the most significant impacts of World War One is what happens in these trenches. And I want you to understand that and be able to explain it in detail. Before we jump right into the trenches, I do want to kind of give you an overview of the way this war is going to be fought. And so let's go to our first map here, our first couple of maps here, and we see this what we call two-front war. So this is the first kind of term you need to know, is this two-front war that we associate with World War One. Why is it a two-front war? Well, obviously, you have the Central Powers running down the central part of Europe, right? Germany, Austria, Hungary, Ottoman Empire, the three primary powers there. And on either side of them, you have Russia on one side, right? And on the other side, you're going to have France and Great Britain primarily, are the focus that we're talking about here. And so when the war begins, the Germans had a plan. As actually a plan goes back earlier, I think it goes all the way back to about 1905, when a man named Alfred von Schlieffen becomes this Schlieffen Plan, which is essentially to take your forces, to fight a two-front war. If you're the Germans, the idea is to fight a two-front war, you want to break one side pretty quickly. So you take all your forces, you march them through Belgium, and then you hit the Western fronts really hard. Try to break the Western front, and then you don't have to worry about fighting two fronts for the entire war. And so down here, on the bottom, you see kind of the overview, and over here, up here, you're going to see the kind of the close-up view of the same idea. And everywhere you see on these maps, the shaded area, the line shaded areas, those represents areas of conquest, right? Areas where one side conquers area from another side. And I'm only going to focus on the West for now. I'm going to do another lecture on the Eastern Front. But when you look at the Western Front, you see initially, the Germans are moving in. And down here, you can see on the smaller, up here on the big one, they move in and they get through Belgium pretty quickly. I mean, the war basically starts around August 1914, August, September, about a month, right? Not much more than a month. They sweep through Belgium down into France, and you see they get pretty close to Paris. There's a river there, the Marne River there, that you can see here on this map as well, right over here, right? Kind of stretches along here. And so that river is where things then kind of turn ugly really quickly. Because yes, the Germans were moving very quickly through Belgium, but when they get to France and they're about 20 miles, 30 miles away from Paris, their plan falls apart. And the reason their plan falls apart is because the French, and then of course as the British come in and give reinforcements and so forth, the French and the British have enough forces to stop the German onslaught. The Germans can't keep moving forward, but this is the problem. The French and the British don't have enough forces to push them out. And so then you get the nightmare scenario. You get the nightmare scenario where both sides start to dig in a very small piece of real estate. And if, again, you look at the overview map here, we're not talking about a lot of territory here, but right there in that little hub of region, you're going to have massive slaughter that humanity has really never seen before to this scale in a war. And this is what's going to happen in the trenches. So that's what I want to describe now is as both sides dig in and you get this new style of warfare, trench warfare, I want you to understand the details of it as part of one of the big impacts of World War One. So this is something I really think is important to understand and teach, and I really want to make sure you understand it at your core level to get what's going on here. So here we go. So this is a great aerial overview of the trenches. And this is what you see, right? You see two sides. You see one side of trenches over here, and then you see another view of trenches on the other side. These trenches, I'm going to kind of describe to you them a little bit, and then I'm going to also show you some more images as we go through this. But just to describe you what the trenches would be like, just try to visualize them about 5, 6, 7 feet deep. You take the dirt that you dig in the trench and you pile it on top. So you got like, this dugout, and then you pile the dirt right on top of the dugout there that you have. The trenches would go on for hundreds of yards to miles, right, depending on where you are on the trenches. One of the things that I want you to definitely know is when you talk about the impacts of World War I, the new warfare, the trench warfare, the details. So they invented things like barbed wire. They didn't necessarily invent it, but they used barbed wire as part of World War I trenches. So you have these barbed wires all along the top. And again, I'm going to show you some good images of this later on. Machine guns would be used in fighting these trenches, especially for the Germans. So the Germans would have machine guns there. Flamethrowers would be something that would be used as well. So these are things you really hadn't seen before. Trenches themselves are not new. People had fought in trenches before. The difference is it's kind of an old style of warfare, but they're using modern military technology, 20th century technology now. And so with this 20th century technology and this kind of old style trenches, it just creates this horrible perfect storm of death and slaughter very often. Now you can also see, so you have one side of trenches, another side, you see the back trenches, but then you see this whole area right in the middle here, right? That's you don't see the trenches there. And that of course has a name, another term you definitely want to know that I have up there for you. This is the infamous no man's land. And we call it no man's land because no one wanted to be there. And I want you to try to visualize what it would be like living in these trenches and what it would be like trying to go through and conquer land in these trenches. Because when you're in these trenches, again, it's dirty. It's crowded. You don't have any sanitation of any sort. It rained. You would have to sleep in the mud. There were rats the size of cats in these trenches. And there would be times where you would have to be told, okay, go across no man's land to go and conquer land. And if you were lucky, some high power artillery shell may just destroy you, right? Because what happened in these trenches and trying to cross no man's land was an absolute nightmare. You might have a group of soldiers leave one trench and they're ordered, go take the trenches from the other side. So they go and leave and they get up and they start marching across no man's land. And as they march across no man's land, let's say there are a bunch of British soldiers and they've got their rifles. On the other side, you have the Germans with the machine guns. And as these British soldiers might be marching through a part of no man's land to get to another trench, they start getting closer to the other trench. Let's say they get 100 feet, 50 feet, 10 feet from the other trench. So if you're a soldier, if you're a German soldier in a trench and you see a British soldier with a rifle coming at you and he's getting, 10 feet, 5 feet, 2 feet from you, you're just a human being in that trench. You have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You got a guy with a rifle is about to come down and shoot you. You don't care about the other 100 people behind him. You care about the guy right there. And so there's stories and accounts of the Germans taking their machine guns and firing them right at an individual as they're running up towards the trench. As the person is running towards the trench and the machine gun bullets are coming up, the machine gun bullets are come with such force that a barrage of bullets often cuts right across the chest. And then the arms and the head and the chest get kind of caught up in the barbed wire, and sometimes the rest of the body is severed and falls to the ground. And that's what it's like in these trenches. And this goes on for days and weeks and months and years. And millions on top of millions of people will either be injured, lose limbs, and of course die. 9 million people will die fighting World War I. And millions other will be permanently scarred physically and emotionally living in these trenches. And so this is what it's like in World War I. And one of the things that's so important to always remember is they thought this war would be easy. They thought it would be over by Christmas. They thought, August, September, October, November, December, they thought it'd be over in like 5, 6 months. And it's going to go on for years. And you know, you're living in these trenches, the conditions, you don't have much time to rest or sleep. And so these were the horrible conditions. And again, if you get a chance to either watch the movie 1917 or that other documentary, and I'm going to show you some documentaries as well as part of my lectures for next week as in the modules, and you'll see some more really good images of this. But let me run through, and I have a couple other names there, Owen and Otto Dix, and I'll explain those names. You can jot them down for now, but I'll explain those last two names there. But definitely you want to know those were the characteristics of the trenches and how they were fought. Let me show you some more images. So this is an example of a group of people leaving a trench, right? So maybe they're just ready to leave a trench, and you can, you know, what are they facing? Well, they might be facing these guys, and these are of course the Germans, and you can tell they're the Germans from the hat, and you can see the machine gun there. And so they're in a trench there, and you have these German forces shooting at you, and there's nowhere to hide. You're just in big open space, and there you're ready to be slaughtered at any given moment. And these are kids, remember, these are 17, 18, 19-year-old kids, and they're fighting this. And as they're fighting this, they're also starting to wonder, why am I here again? Right? This is, you know, I'll explain this in more detail later, but this is not like World War II where there was a clear, good reason to be doing this for many of these guys. And so this is going to add to the horror of it all. This is the gas. So one of the big impacts of World War I is gas weapons being used. Mustard gas, kind of a chlorine, greenish color gas that would be used, that would be something new in warfare. You've never seen this before in war to this type of scale. And so using chemical weapons to fight a war, it was something that the Germans used first, but eventually both sides will use this chemical weapons, and it will, of course, be something that will leave horrific marks on individuals. So this would be an example of a gas cloud exploding during the war. This is gas mask, and you could look at the mask, and it's not very effective at all. It's basically like somebody tied a plastic bag around your head. They had other masks that were obviously a little bit better and developed, but overall, a lot of these masks did not do much at all. And then I have this other image I want to show you. Take a look at this one. This is one of the best images I have ever found of a trench, right? There's a lot of images out there you could see, but I love this one because it really shows you life in a trench, right? And if you look at it carefully, you know, you could see, you know, people, and I ask my students, and they go, is this person dead? Oh, they may not even be dead. They may be sleeping, but this is where you sleep. And you see how narrow it is, right? You can see how they pile the dirt up. You see where they, you know, in these boxes that you see in places is where they may have stored supplies or food. But what I really want you to notice, and sometimes I have observant students or observant viewers who see this and they go, wow, this is really stunning. Look at the soldier, and which soldier is this? And from the uniform, some people, oh, that's British. Yeah, that's a British soldier. Now look closely, and I want you to focus on his hand. And look how dark his hand is. And so this is a British soldier, right? Obviously, this British guy is white, right? And yet you look at his hand and you see how dark his hand is, and it gives you a sense of the filth and the dirt that they're living in and day out. So it's something small and subtle, but it shows you just you're not going to shower and bathe or any of that, and living in these trenches. So this is what it's like during World War I. This is what the trenches are all about. And so remember this image I kind of left off with last lecture, right? And it's this image of people celebrating and this euphoria. And this was the dream that they were living. But as World War I raged on, in the Western Front especially, and people are fighting these trenches, we go from what is this dream. If this is the image before, this next image is the image that people felt during and by the end of the war. And it's this image, very powerful, of a man named Otto Dix. Otto Dix was a World War I artist. And if you pause, it's stunning. The face, the gripping the chest. It is just such, a harsh image of what he saw the war as. And so, I can describe trench warfare to you. I could show you pictures of the trenches. I could show you an artistic rendering of how an artist may have seen the trenches. But to me, I think the best way to understand what the trenches did to people is listening to the words of people who were there. Primary sources. I'm always very big on using primary sources to study history. And there was a young man named Wilfred Owen who fought in World War I. Wilfred Owen was a poet. He was British. He was a gifted poet, very young when the war broke out. He was 18, 19 years old. He joined the war, and when he fought in the war, it inspired him to write a poem. The title of the poem is Duce decorum est po patria mori, and I have a link to you in your module either this week or next week, so you can actually look at the poem and you're going to read it again. But the title translates, to die for the fatherland is a sweet and becoming thing. To die for the fatherland is a sweet and becoming thing. I want you to hear these words from this poem and listen carefully, especially keeping in mind what people thought the war was going to be like. So this is the actual poem. This is how it goes. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the wide eyes withering in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of bile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell children adoring for some desperate glory the old lie, Duce decorum est po patria mori. The old lie, to die for the fatherland is a sweet and becoming thing. So you see, when you talk about the effects of World War I and the impacts, it's not just 9 million people died. It's not just the millions more that were injured. It is what it does to the soul of humanity that is so captured well in this image in that poem by Wilfred Owen. And Wilfred Owen is going to die shortly after composing that poem, which makes it all even more tragic. And the reason it's so important is that it shows us how this war took all that optimism that existed before the war and just stomped all over it. And there is no more optimism, there is no more hope, and maybe that is the most important impact of the war. It makes people feel there's like a vacuum of beliefs, that there's nothing positive to grip onto, and you go, okay, well, why does that matter? Well, guys, in history, when people have a vacuum of beliefs, when there's nothing positive and hopeful anymore, very often people turn to, fill those vacuums. And what we end up seeing in the 1920s, 1930s, into the 1940s is those vacuum of beliefs will be filled by some of the most soul-destroying ideologies man has ever created, whether it's Nazism or communism or fascism, all these totalitarian regimes that we're going to go into in more detail. But I definitely think World War I set all that up, this whole lost generation that you get as a result of the war. And even that is not the worst impact of World War I. What happens, and this is something so important to think about, guys, World War I really made very little sense in terms of a war that was fought. Why are the British fighting the Germans? It didn't really make much sense, right? But it was happening. And then the dark irony of this is a war that people jumped into way too fast for very little, if no good reason at all. And then a generation later, when Hitler was rising to power, so many people who were young during World World War I, remembered World War I, remembered the trench warfare, they thought to themselves, well, yeah, Hitler's a bad guy, but do we really want to deal with him? Remember how bad World War I was? And the darkest irony is World War II, that they should have started earlier, that people should have told Hitler no, they should have, fought against Hitler earlier, right? They didn't. They appeased him. They allowed him to become stronger and allowed him to do much more harm. And instead of 9 million, you're going to have, tens and tens of millions people being killed. And of course, civilians rounded up and experimented on like animals and burnt alive and put in gas chambers because people didn't want to fight against Hitler. And one of the core reasons why people didn't want to fight against Hitler was because of the horror of World War I. And so this is when I say it's important to understand the impacts of the war, not just during the war. Yeah, during the war, the trench warfare, right after the war, which we're going to talk about, but even a generation later, because when we do our World War II lecture, we're going to come back to all this. So I hope all of that is really clear and it resonates with you in understanding all of this. So where do we go from here? Well, the next thing to talk about, of course, is going to be, the war in the Eastern Front. And so all of that is going on in the West. And so now what we're going to need to do is from there, talk about the Eastern Front of the war and talk about all the things that are going to happen in the East. And I'm going to kind of cover that in our next lectures and then finally how the war ends. All right, I hope all that's clear and you got all the good information down. You guys have a good day. Thank you, everyone.